Hello and welcome. We're discussing 40 years of egg donation and counting. What have we learned? What happens next? The hashtag for this event is Pet Donor, and this discussion has been made possible thanks to the kind support of Gideon Richter. And although they have sponsored this webinar, they have had no input into the content or the speaker selection. And Gideon Richter has, however, reviewed the slides, but for factual accuracy only. Now, November 1983 saw the birth in Australia of the world's first ever child conceived with a donor egg. And for the first time in human history, it became meaningful to distinguish between a child's genetic and gestational mother. Now, I don't know about you, but it seems amazing to me that egg donation is more than 40 years old. Egg donation has transformed the lives of many women and their partners, giving them the chance to have children. And from my previous work at the Daisy Network, which supports women with primary ovarian insufficiency here in the UK, I know many happy families that have been created this way. Now, it may have caught your attention that in the sort of entertainment industry, there's a real fashion for origin stories. And the anniversary of an event is the ideal opportunity to explore the backstory of how that event came about. And we're thrilled to have Professor Alan Trounson on tonight's panel, who was working with the team at Monash in Melbourne when the first egg donation child was born. And Pet firmly believes that these scientific origin stories, so to speak, need to be told and retold so that new generations understand the scientific, the legal, and the ethical issues that breakthroughs such as egg donation bring with them and are understood and not forgotten. And egg donation hasn't stood still for the last 40 years. Its applications now include helping same-sex male couples have children, helping same-sex female couples share motherhood by one carrying an embryo conceived with the other's egg, and also in helping people avoid the transmission of mitochondrial diseases. And at this PET event, experts will explore the science, medicine, law, and ethics of egg donation from its beginnings more than 40 years ago to the present day and beyond. Now, I very much wanted to have an egg donor conceived person from Australia on the panel, but despite my best endeavours, and perhaps because this is the first event PET has planned aimed at an Australian audience, we were unable to find someone. And I know that this will be a disappointment to some of you. It's a disappointment to me. However, I hope this event will be the first of many that we do, engaging with people in Australia. So if you're interested in getting involved in future events, please get in touch. So our first speaker is Professor Alan Trounson. Alan is a pioneer in the fields of IVF and stem cell research. He's an emeritus professor at Monash University and at the Australian Regenerative Medicine Institute. He's a distinguished scientist at the Hudson Institute of Medical Research. He's a former president of the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, and he is now chief executive of Cartherix. Alan was appointed an officer of the Order of Australia for Distinguished Service to Medical Science and to in vitro fertilization and stem cell technologies in 2021.
I'm a cell biologist, and so my vision of the world is really through cell biology. So when we think about IVF in Melbourne, it started in the 1970s, and Carl Wood's team, he was the leader of the team at the time, had a brief clinical pregnancy in 1972, but there were no more successes. I joined the team in 1977, leaving Cambridge and joining Wood, who had received a Ford Foundation grant to work on IVF, which was the only grant I think that Wood ever held, actually. When I got there, I worked on other projects because there were already people working on the IVF in the 70s. But in 79, I began working with John Leeton, one of the clinicians, to translate kind of mammalian sort of physiology into human IVF and take what I knew as animal reproductive physiology and see if I could translate that to the human medicine. There was a birth of a baby by the natural cycle in IVF in 1980, but I was convinced that you needed to use fertility drugs in order to enable IVF to occur, because there was no way of actually programming the procedure, and it was incredibly difficult working off the natural cycle when you're trying to collect an egg sometime during the day, any hour of the day, 24 hours a day. You couldn't really program the whole thing unless you used fertility drugs, which we used in animals. So here's Wood and here's Leeton, and they were the pioneer clinicians that I joined, and they basically enabled me to do what I was interested in translating what I knew in animal science through to the human. So we published a successful superovulation in human IVF, which in 1981, which really established the way you should do it. It was really a matter of driving up the follicles and growing the eggs, and then timing the time of ovulation with an injection of human chorionic gonadotropin. So you could actually then program the patients, and you could move through patients in a time where you could utilize the hospital facilities in a sensible manner. We were growing viable human embryos through to the blastocysts at that time. So we knew that we had some control of the whole system, and we were working very closely with all the patients who I really, at that time, I considered them, part of the team in developing all of this, and their views were really important to me. And there were a lot of these patients who were really having major problems, either too old or they're unable to produce eggs, or there was some reason that they couldn't. So I got interested in egg and embryo donation. And again, it was a translation from what we did in the animals. It's a busy slide, but essentially, this is the way my mind was working at the time, that if we were able to superovulate a donor, then we could use the eggs for that donor, and maybe she'd be willing to donate 1 or 2 eggs to an infertile recipient. And in the first place, that was what we published in the British Medical Journal, that we're able to synchronize a donor and recipient for their ovulation, and using the donor's husband's sperm for their own embryos, so they could be returned to them. But we would use the recipient's husband's sperm to fertilize 1 or 2 eggs and transfer to them. And we established a pregnancy. It didn't go to term, unfortunately, but what it did was to drive me into thinking, well, in the animals, we're able to create an artificial cycle all the way through pregnancy. So in sheep, for example, they're only ovulatory in the autumn, and in the spring they're anovulatory. They don't ovulate at all. So what we were doing was wanting to actually use those sheep breeding all year round, and we created what was artificial cycles in those sheep. And when we transferred embryos to those sheep, they would go all the way through pregnancy. So we had already designed something that would actually work in animals. And I thought if we could figure out how to do that, was to build up the endometrium in women who were anovulatory, that didn't ovulate, and we could actually time the build-up in the endometrium, as shown up here in the right, build up the endometrium so it's going to be receptive to an embryo. And then if you had an embryo that was donated and hopefully fertilized by the patient's husband's sperm, you could transfer that to this artificially induced endometrium, and it would then be able to continue in pregnancy. But there was a lot of criticism at the time about the approach to this, because people felt that we couldn't get all the way through pregnancy. We might initiate a pregnancy, but it would fall off because we had no ovarian function in those women. Didn't have a corpus luteum, didn't have a follicle, didn't have a corpus luteum. It didn't have what was required to maintain uterine endometrium during pregnancy. And so we felt that we had to, what we would need to do was to enable the endometrium to grow and to maintain during early pregnancy. So there were two situations. So I'm just showing you here the paper we published in the British Medical Journal, which shows the donor's estrogen up at the high level on the left-hand side. And this is the recipient's estrogen level at much lower. The reason that the donor is having superovulation, so there's many follicles growing in that patient. So there's a difference there. You can see estrogen levels increasing. And the important part is we were able to time the LH surge, which is the actual timing for ovulation, within a day. So here around day 13, right on the cusp of 14, both of those patients were showing a surge of luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland, which would mean that they were ovulating pretty much on the same day. And therefore we were synchronized. And then when we obtained embryos from the eggs from the donor, we were able to fertilize those and return them to the donor. And we also had one or two eggs that were able to fertilize and transfer to the recipient. In that case, it established a pregnancy. As I said, it didn't continue all the way through. In the second case, where we were able to take it all the way to birth, this is the artificial cycle shown up on the left-hand side at the top. So we used estradiol valerate pills that we could actually drive up the estrogen, and that's shown in the figure in the right here. These are the estrogen valerate, and these are the estrogen levels in the patient. So we're able to create a growth in the endometrium through the estrogen, and then we gave the patients progesterone pessaries as if she had ovulated. And these pessaries that contain progesterone were able to be delivered from the vagina, and they were then entered the circulation, so that we were able to build an endometrial profile for the patient. And you can see the plasma luteinizing hormone shown here. Sorry, not the human chorionic gonadotrophin shown here. What was where the issue really was whether we continue the whole of the pregnancy with both progesterone and estrogen. We didn't really have to, because the placenta took over the pregnancy and managed the pregnancy all the way to birth. We thought that we may not be able to get through the birth process because there was no relaxin, which was thought to be part of the birth process. You'd have to release relaxin to enable you to give birth. But that's not true. It turned out that these patients were able to give birth perfectly normally. So this was the first successful donor egg, donor embryo, whatever you wanted to call it. And it was, when we did it, there was quite a response to that, because because we've been moving this technology fairly quickly, the Victorian government felt that, we were travelling too fast for them. Suddenly having IVF success and then having donor success and freezing embryos as well at the same time. They wanted to sort of slow this process down a bit, because they were concerned that we might be on a slippery slope to wherever they thought we were going. And the state committee, which was a Waller committee, which was overseeing IVF, actually, when we went to them, they actually voted for egg and embryo donation to be continued in 1984, but the laws were not drafted or enacted. They were drafted in 84, but not enacted till 1988. So all the patients that we had there couldn't get any treatment in Victoria, and they had to go somewhere else for treatment for those 4 years. So this is a sort of issue of government controlling reproductive processes, and they're holding the key to reproduction in this particular cartoon, and that's the way I felt it was really it was something that was really unfair and unreasonable, because there were people on our list who really were desperately wanting to have children, and the 4 or 5 years of waiting for this was just completely unreasonable. But it didn't matter. We really had to do what the government said. They wouldn't allow us to continue. The threats were quite severe if we did. So we eventually got there. But I think overall, at the time, my thoughts were really about trying to help women who were unable to ovulate themselves, who were unable to produce eggs through IVF, and this was a way in which we could help them by a donation process. I hadn't really thought about the larger perspectives of all of this at the time, but it became clear later on that this was something that was going to be very important for utilisation for patients in many different kinds of situations.
So we have Stephen Page next, who is director of the law firm Page Provan. He was awarded the 2023 President's Medal by the Queensland Law Society. Previously, Stephen was a lecturer in ethics and law in reproductive medicine at the University of New South Wales, and he is author of the book When Not If: Surrogacy for Australians.
The first I want to start with something obvious that Alan didn't realise when he was pioneering this field, how it might develop. In a different mode, but in the same building, this is my husband Mitchell and my daughter Elizabeth. Mitchell and I are parents through surrogacy. This was all done here in Brisbane. We were very lucky, unlike most intended parents in Australia who are doing surrogacy, they've got to go overseas. We were able to do it locally. And our daughter was also conceived from a known donor. So the good news, so far as she is concerned, is that we don't have any difficulty at all telling her about where she came from. And that's been one of the challenges, of course, with egg donation, sperm donation, that parents haven't talked to their children about where they've come from. It's often seen as being something secret, at least in the past. In our case, of course, we don't have much choice about that. And that's true, I think, for same-sex couples generally, that there has to be a discussion about where the child's come from. And it might be thought that this is something that is going to happen later in life. But I'll just show you this photo of my daughter. At that stage, she was 18 months old. And you can see that she was sitting on the floor in our back room with the empty and clean yogurt bucket on her head. At that stage, she was in a childcare facility of 165 families. And in inner city Brisbane. So one would expect that there would be lots of gay and lesbian parents, but apparently not for some reason. And she worked out at the age of 18 months that she was the only child in that childcare centre who had two dads. So the idea that we might be saying to our daughter later on in life about where she's come from is a fiction. She worked out at 18 months. So it's one of those things that we've had to speak to her in age-appropriate manner about where she's come from. And that's not only about surrogacy, but it's also necessarily about egg donation, so that she is comfortable with who she is. It's part of her story that she lives with every day. And the thing about Australia is that we're probably the most overgoverned country in the world. We have a population, I think, of about 26 or 27 million, and yet we have a whole bunch of laws, because we don't have any national laws or no consistent national laws about this topic. The Commonwealth has laws that prohibit egg donation other than being altruistic. Any commercial egg donation is prohibited. And because of the unique setup of Australia and Commonwealth, and that means Australian government abilities to pass laws, Australian Parliament ability to pass laws, we also therefore have, in essence, a national scheme with matching state and territory laws saying that egg donation must be altruistic. And as I was saying before, in the old days in Australia and certainly around the world, it was certainly secret squirrel stuff. This is secret squirrel, by the way. the doctors would be saying to patients, look, you can't describe, you can't say that you've had donation, don't tell the child, and therefore the donor was anonymous. And what we see around the world today is that in some places, and I'll just give an example, Spain, donation is anonymous. That's certainly not the case in Australia and hasn't been for 20 years. For the last 20 years in Australia, we have open identity donation, namely if you're not a known donor, then the child can find out, the donor conceived person can find out from the ages of 16 or 18, depending on the place, about where they came from. But in other places in the world, it still remains anonymous. So that's been, I think that's an ongoing challenge worldwide. And the idea of anonymity now is dead. Databases like Ancestry.com, 23andme.com, as well as tools such as Google reverse image search, means that the idea that you have an anonymous donor now is really, it's really quite dated. And so this is what we've seen across Australia. We've had this requirement about donation being open, but there's been challenges, and an example of that challenge we've seen in a couple of cases. One of those cases was my case, funnily enough, of Clarence and Crisp, where we had a lesbian couple and they wanted to become parents. I acted for the older woman. She was getting close to 40, I should say. The younger woman was 10 years younger. And as it turns out, my client, knowing the biological clock, was really pressing to do IVF now. They had the same sperm donor for both. And despite a couple of attempts, it turns out that the embryos created from my client's eggs weren't viable. At which point her partner or former partner said, well, why don't you use mine? And offered them. The first time didn't work, the second time worked, and a child was born. But the issue in question was the woman who provided the embryos, or the embryo that resulted in the child, was she a donor or was she a parent? And it went all the way through to trial, and then it went on appeal. And ultimately the court found that the woman who provided the embryo was a parent because the couple had been in a relationship at the time, something that was the centre of the dispute all along. The other case of Masson and Parsons concerned a gay man who provided sperm to a lesbian friend, and a child was born from an at-home insemination. That all worked. Both their names went on the birth certificate as the mother and father. The woman was had just started a relationship with another woman. They got engaged, and then they married, and they had a second child through a clinic recruited sperm donor. These kids were aged 9 and 10 when the man discovered that the women wanted to move to New Zealand, so he went to court to stop them. And the problem that then manifested itself was, well, was he a parent? And the women said, well, you're a donor, you weren't a parent. And the High Court of Australia then said, well, that he was a parent because he supplied his sperm on the express or implied understanding to be a parent. He put his name on the birth certificate for the same purpose, and after the elder child was born, he parented. But the result of that case has meant that there's had to be a determination when there is a known donor about whether that person intends to be a donor or they intend to be a parent. And that can be quite contentious. Victoria's got retrospective transparency. It was the first in the world to do that. Recently, South Australia has joined Victoria, and that's been controversial. South Australia declined to do so earlier, and then there's been a push by donor-conceived adults to change that, so that change has now come through. The ACT has now enacted the Assisted Reproductive Technology Act that commenced a couple of weeks ago. or at least parts of it did. And later this year, its retrospective transparency registry will also be in place. The ACT has done something new with its act, which is that there must be, after the commencement of the act, any child born after that, a parent of that child can find out the identities of the donor. So that's quite a significant change, and there will be people who donated who were expecting that, well, 18 years hence, that child can find out who I am, but now they're being confronted, or will be confronted, that at the latest by the 25th of March 2025, that portion of the Act may commence before then, that each child born after that, the parent can find out who the donor is. Queensland is to legislate, according to the Health Minister, this year, which means before the election, which is in October, to have its own Assisted Reproductive Technology Act. And in there will be a donor registry, and that will be retrospective as well. It's quite clear that's coming in. And Western Australia, it's rewriting its Human Reproductive Technology Act, which originally dates from 1992, and its Surrogacy Act from 2008. We haven't seen the bill, but also as part of the electoral cycle, the WA government going to the polls in January next year, there will be a bill, there will be an act in place. I just don't know whether it will be retrospective. And now I'll talk about that lovely topic of caps, because this is something that is a challenge around the world. Certainly in Australia, we have caps on donors, and Australia being Australia, there is not a consistent number. Generally, it's 10 women or 10 families. New South Wales is 5 women, but you include the female partner. Of course, that's mainly talking about sperm. West Australia is interesting because it's 5 recipient families worldwide. It's a very tight definition. Otherwise, it's 10. And donor-conceived adults are certainly very clear in saying that the limit should be 5. But the reality is that people go overseas, and we have import and export of eggs and sperm and embryos. And to give you an idea of the challenge, in 2016, I attended at a South African IVF clinic where the medical director informed me that 3 to 5 Australian couples were going there, heterosexual couples were going there every business day for egg donation. Many overseas donors are paid, donations are anonymous, and in Australia we are currently or about to import eggs from the US, Malaysia, South Africa and Ukraine. And in 2 Australian jurisdictions, Western Australia and Victoria, permission is required to be able to import donor gametes or embryos made from donor gametes, and that's Western Australia with the Reproductive Technology Council, and Victoria from the Victorian Assisted Reproductive Treatment Authority. Other Australian jurisdictions don't require that approval.
So moving on now from Stephen, we have Professor Catherine Mills, and Catherine is Professor of Bioethics at Monash University. She is head of Monash University's School of Philosophical, Historical and International Studies. She's the author of many papers and several books, including one entitled Biopolitics.
I'm going to start by just thanking Sarah for extending this invitation to me, and also just acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which I live and work, and I extend respects to the leaders past and present of the Kulin Nation. So I've been asked to speak about the ethics of egg donation, but I want to do this from a fairly practical perspective, that is recognising the current conditions of egg donation and access to donor eggs, and thinking through how that might be improved. Now, of course, improving a system is not always an ethical question, but I think in the case of egg donation, it actually is, because at the moment, the system in Australia and elsewhere is not really working, and I think there's an increasing ethical imperative to actually improve it. So what we know is there are dramatic shortages of egg donors for people seeking to use them for reproduction, and there are negligible eggs available to progress research. Further, that there's evidence that the current system is not serving those people who do donate well. They don't necessarily understand what their options are, and they are often not able to dispose of their eggs in the way that they would prefer. This is particularly the case with the rise of egg freezing for fertility preservation. So to keep this short talk focused, I'm going to concentrate on the Australian context, though I expect that some of what I say will be relevant more broadly. So as Stephen mentioned, Australia relies on an altruistic model of egg donation, or what I like to think of as a BYOD system, which is, bring your own donor. So what we can see is that the overwhelming majority of egg donors are actually recipient sourced, which means that the burden of recruitment is placed on the prospective procreators. So often it's people that friends or sisters and so on, and the burden of finding that donor falls on the person who wishes to use the egg. Only 7% at the moment of egg donors are actually recruited through clinics. More people actually access eggs overseas. 12% are sourced internationally through patients travelling to international clinics or to importation of eggs. So it's important to note that even in that circumstances, the eggs have to meet the altruistic criteria. So it's widely recognised that this system is actually leading to quite chronic shortages and potential harms to procreators. So there's a number of solutions that have been proposed. One such solution, a local solution, is the idea of a public egg bank. So this is currently in development in Victoria, funded by the Victorian government. And part of the remit of that local egg bank is to actually have an education and awareness program to help promote egg donation as a possibility. But it still will have to maintain an altruistic way of encouraging that donation, or of ensuring that the compensation is done altruistically. So other international solutions, such as egg sharing in the UK, have been around for some time. As I understand it, the use of that in the UK is actually decreasing. And for many circumstances, or at least for some circumstances, it's not going to be appropriate. There are also, I think, increasing conversations around what compensation should look like for egg donation. And so there's been lots of bioethical discussion around questions of compensation so far. We have different models of compensation in practice. So, for instance, in the UK, there's a kind of set fee compensation, which I believe has just recently been increased from £750 to close to £1,000. So I want to, at this point, just tease out this question of compensation a little bit more. So as I said, currently in Australia, we have an altruistic model which supports reimbursement with receipt. So donors can really only be reimbursed for direct verifiable costs. So that means that for egg donors, there's strictly no benefit to them except a kind of moral benefit of having done an altruistic act. But we might think that given the kinds of shortages that we're looking at, this system does have some social costs, at least as it's currently done. The opposite of this would be a kind of remuneration system, or really a full market-based model of payment for eggs. This would require an abandonment of altruistic values, but evidence suggests that this is actually not preferred by either donors or recipients. So it's not necessarily the way we want to go. Instead, I think we need to think more thoroughly around the question of compensation and what compensation actually means. So we know that the UK has its set fee system. And there have been other proposals as well around things like discounting of services that could incentivise in some circumstances, and I'll come back to that briefly in a moment. But it's worth noting, I think, that the Australian legislation actually prohibits discounting of services because it might be understood as an inducement. So compensation should be thought of as counteracting the disadvantages of doing something, including, for example, time, effort, and suffering. Compensation could leave someone financially better off, but this should not constitute an incentive to take a particular course of action. So here we might think about reimbursement slightly differently. We could think about a reimbursement model that builds in an additional tariff or interest in recognition of the risk and burden of egg donation. Say reimbursement at 120% of receipts rather than just just the direct costs. So that's food for thought in terms of reproduction, but it's still not going to solve issues around the shortage of research eggs. We know that there's increasing demand. This is an increasing issue as demand grows through programs such as the new clinical trial for mitochondrial donation that's running here at Monash University. Sorry. So another part of this picture of the ethics of egg donation is really this issue of egg freezing. We know that the rate of people freezing eggs has grown significantly in the last decade or so, as you can see on that graph. At the same time, though, very few people actually return to use those eggs. Data varies, but in some studies, the rate of return could be as low as 4%. So that means there's a rapidly expanding number of eggs in storage, and the cost effectiveness of egg freezing is low. Now, one suggestion then that has been made is to promote donation of these eggs by compensating the cost of freezing when eggs that are no longer required are donated to someone else. This is, I think, an interesting suggestion, but it might fall foul of the prohibition of discounting of services in Australia. And in any case, it's still not going to generate the number of eggs required for research. So the question that arises then is what is actually happening to these eggs? Well, in a study that my team undertook with one clinic group in Victoria, we discovered that while over 20,000 eggs are currently in storage in 2022 alone in one clinic group in Victoria, of those reaching the end of the storage period at this time, 215 were donated for reproduction, none were donated for research, and over 1,000 were simply discarded at the end of their storage period. What's particularly interesting about this is that we know that at the beginning of the freezing process, most women actually express their preference to be able to donate their excess eggs at the end of the storage period, either to reproduction or to research. What this makes us think then is that there might be significant impediments in the process that enables them to do so. And importantly, one of those impediments might actually be how we currently do the consent process. So just from my very rough kind of map of the current consent process, you can see that at the moment we do consent for freezing at the beginning of the process, but consent for the disposition of what people do at the end of the process with their eggs is actually quite a long way later. So it goes through consent for freezing, then treatment and collection, storage, whether you use them or not. And then when you're coming up to the end of your storage period, you are then asked what you would like to do with those eggs. So you're currently contacted near the end of the freezing period and asked whether you would like to consent to donation for reproduction, donate for research, or discard. And when there's no reply, the eggs have to be discarded. I suggest we think seriously about changing this process such that disposition intentions are captured at the beginning of the process, as well as the consent for freezing. This consent for disposition would then be maintained as the desired disposition pathway, unless the person changes their desired option throughout. Further, rather than having discard as the default option, if no other preference is registered and the person can't be contacted, we should consider donation to research as the default option. Naturally, this would need good systems and platforms to maintain valid consent and to allow people to opt out of the default option of donation to research if they wished. And here I think we might learn valuable things from the transformation of consent processes and systems underway in genomics, such as the dynamic consent platform, for instance. But I'm going to leave further exploration of that suggestion for another day. So I will simply finish with acknowledging the funding that has supported this research, as well as giving particular thanks to several of my colleagues. First, Molly Johnson for her leadership of our project on egg freezing and disposition, Julian Copland for his important work on rethinking compensation for donated biological materials, and Amy Webb for helping put these slides together for me.
So we have now the final speaker today, and that is Nicky is Professor of Medical Sociology at De Montfort University, which is in Leicester here in the UK. She is Director of the Centre for Reproduction Research, and she has published research about aspects of egg donation, including genetic testing, vitrification, fertility clinic websites, egg donor forums, and known donations.
I'm going to talk a little bit today about research we've been doing on contemporary egg donation and some of the implications in the field that we've already heard about in recent years, and particularly thinking about the experiences and welfare of donors within that context. So the project that I'm going to speak briefly about is the EDNA study, which is a large-scale interdisciplinary study looking at specifically at the European context. And within that, we looked at 3 study sites, the UK, Belgium, and Spain. And we used a range of methods. We spoke to a range of stakeholders, including donors, and we were really interested in the specifics of the European context, but also the contemporary landscape, given, as we know, egg donation is now 40 years old. So we were interested in Europe for a number of reasons. Surprisingly, given the fact that a large proportion, in fact, most egg donation globally happens in Europe, over 60% of cycles, there is very little, or there had been very little research with donors in the European context. Europe's also interested in regulatory terms. We have in Europe and formerly in the UK, the EU Tissue and Cells Directive, which is a pan-European regulation which explicitly outlaws the commercialisation of gametes, and it interestingly also encourages strong involvement of public and non-profit making sectors within the context of tissue donation, which makes it really interesting in regulatory terms. But despite this regulation, we have had a number of changes in the sector which are will be relevant in the Australian context too, I'm sure, and in other contexts that have moved egg donation into a slightly different technical and commercial space that made it a really interesting site for us to carry out research. The other interesting thing to say is that this regulatory framework has been adopted in different ways in different national countries within the European context, and different cultural and kind of local politics have played into that, making the cases quite interesting. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A if people are interested. So the first thing to highlight about the European context, and our data and our research confirm this, is that egg donation has become more routinized in fertility treatment, and we've heard this already from the other speakers. So this slide shows the increase in the use of donor egg in IVF in Europe over the last 20 years. So it's now used in 7% of treatment cycles. It's often first-line treatment in the context of age-related fertility decline. And as we've heard already, it's used in an increasingly diverse range of treatment scenarios. And just to kind of highlight some of that diversity, this slide slightly busy slide represents our attempts to try and map some of the different contexts in which donated eggs are used within the 3 countries that we were working. So you can see the 3 countries highlighted in blue, yellow and red. On the left-hand side of this slide are contexts in which the donor and recipient are not known to one another at the point eggs are provided. And on the right-hand side, where they are, it's probably not exhaustive. It's probably there are changes all the time in the ways in which people use donor egg. But this came about because we were trying to get a handle on these kinds of ideas of altruistic and non-altruistic donation and known and unknown donation. And we actually decided there were a number of different ways in which eggs and sperm, of course, but eggs in this case could be used in different kinds of contexts. And that led us to thinking about egg donation in the multiple and thinking about egg donation as a plural phenomenon, and in that, you know, we're very rarely talking about the same thing, and the experiences of donating, providing eggs in these contexts and receiving them will vary. It also highlights, I think, some of the ways in which both the increase in egg donation, but also the diversification and how that has become entangled with increasing levels of commercialization. And so we were interested in mapping some of that change within the 3 countries in which we were working. And of course, it's related very much to how much egg donation is provided in the public sector, which varied greatly in the 3 countries that we were working. So in the rest of this presentation, I want to highlight some of the changes that we mapped around the ways in which eggs are procured and used increasingly, and how that has become more commercialized in lots of ways. So the first thing to highlight, we've already heard about the increase in the use of freezing in the context of egg donation. We've written about some of these changes in a paper that I've flagged up on screen there. And vitrification has been adopted more enthusiastically in some contexts than others. There are differences within countries in terms of how much vitrification is used, but it certainly enabled clinics to have a more efficient use of donor eggs. It's allowed clinics to be able to untangle the process of receiving the eggs from the process of giving the eggs in a treatment cycle. So it's removed the necessity for donors and recipients to be in the clinic at the same time, for example. So it's really transformed the ways in which donor egg treatment happens. And we hear a lot about egg freezing in the context of people freezing their own eggs, but as Catherine's just highlighted, there are relationships between egg donation and egg freezing. And so it's allowed for greater efficiency, and it's allowed egg banks to exist. And we do have a number of egg banks now within the European context. Some of those are within clinic egg banks, and we have clinical groups which share eggs between their different clinics. But we have also got more egg banks that work on a more commercialized model, that are shipping eggs within countries, but also between countries, and clinics are starting to import them. And some of them have patient-facing websites and portals where patients can now select eggs on the basis of a kind of catalogue. And so it's really changed the ways in which eggs are managed and organised. The second change that I wanted to highlight was around the selection of donors. And again, we wrote something for BioNews recently, a couple of weeks ago, around screening donors and the new ways in which donors are screened. And just wanted to highlight two different aspects of this. Artificial intelligence, the use of artificial intelligence in the selection of donors, around facial matching technology, but also the use of new forms of genetic screening of donors. And in some cases, we see clinics now starting to offer packages whereby donors can be screened for different genetic conditions to exclude the possibility that any offspring might inherit a genetic condition, coupled with things like AI matching technology, which allows clinics to offer donors, offer recipients the idea of the perfect match. And this is really transforming the selection process and placing egg donation, I think, more in that kind of boutique treatment category, creating new hierarchies of donors, and potentially with the possibility of encouraging more facility travel. And then the third change is not directly linked to donation itself, but it's this broader change that we've seen, that we've already heard about, of the use of ancestry testing for people to trace donors, which is having a broader social cultural change and is being used increasingly by donor conceived families, people in the donor conception community, to trace donors and create connections that didn't exist previously. And this means that people are able to contact one another and have connections outside of formal regulatory systems. And this is the subject of a second project that I'm involved in, that Lucy Frith is leading at Manchester. There's a paper there that we've published recently on some of the early data from this project. And what we don't know, actually, even from the new research that we're doing, is how that might pan out in the future in relationship to egg donation. Egg donation is obviously relatively young in comparison to sperm donation, and there are fewer connections that we know about through egg donation. And it would be interesting to see if that changes in coming years as the increasing egg donation plays out and vitrification plays into that. I wanted to finish just by flagging some of the work that we've published from our study around donors' views and commercialisation. So I've highlighted a few of the ways in which egg donation is becoming more commercialised, including the introduction of intermediaries into the landscape, egg banks, egg agencies, and so on in Europe. And when we spoke to donors about their views of commercialisation, they were actually very cautious about the idea of commercialisation. So this is just a couple of examples. In this paper, we were speaking to them specifically about vitrification. So talking to them about things like batching eggs, shipping eggs abroad. And across all three countries, donors were very cautious for a variety of reasons about the move towards increased commercialisation, and specifically the idea that clinics could make more profit from their eggs. So something to bear in mind, I think, in thinking about what next. Which leads me quite nicely on. So I think what is coming out of our research is that we are seeing a broad and varied range of technological and commercial changes around egg donation, some of which donors themselves either don't know about or are cautious about. And I think what we need to think about is a broader discussion of how policy sometimes doesn't keep up with practice in this field, and egg donation has kind of, I think, been ignored to a degree as other kind of technological advances have taken centre stage, and we need to keep policy under review. And then just to finish by thanking our enormous team across the three countries and our funders and partners in this research. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicky. Now, before I go to the audience's questions, I just wondered whether any of the panelists wanted to comment on something that had come up in another presentation before we move to that. So I don't know if there's anything. Yes, Alan.
I just wanted to sort of ask Catherine a bit about, she was emphasising the egg research. I mean, it seems to me there's three distinct possibilities here that need to be played out. One, there's a lot of animal eggs that are available. You just need to go to the abattoirs and get them in, and you know, they're of a species that are the same kind of size and so forth as the human. And secondly, you could actually, I mean, I don't know why there's a 10-year limit on eggs. I can understand more on embryos, but why can't they then be donated to a public process? Why wouldn't they? The outcome of that, rather than discarding them, which is a wasteful process. Why don't you get them? Concentrate on getting them put into a public thing. And the other thing is that the scientists have really got, the stem cells going into oocytes, starting to work in species, and I think in the human it's getting there as well. So the research side, I don't see it so much. I mean, my concern's a bit more about, the reproductive use of oocytes, but I think that the research side could be accommodated by those other things, and but we've still got obviously problems on the reproductive side, as you described. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to answer that if I might. I mean, I think you're right, Alan. I mean, there are kind of different issues in regards to reproduction and research that we need to think about differently in some ways. And it's the suggestion that I mean, a few different things can happen at the end of that storage period. I mean, one is that it can just be extended for another 5 years, for instance. So that's an option. Often people just don't know what they need, want to do at that point. So then moving eggs to a public egg bank for the purposes of donation. I mean, then you're still thinking about what would the consent process be for being able to do that, and for them to then be kind of used for reproduction, presumably. In terms of the research side, I mean, I think, yes, we can use animal eggs, but there's a point at which they stop being enough, in a sense. So thinking particularly about the kind of current mitochondrial donation trial, we can do a lot of that research in animal eggs. But at some point, you want an embryologist to actually be working on human eggs before you're going to create a child from those eggs. So I think because we're doing kind of experimental reproduction, I think it's actually quite important that for some research that we actually do the work with human eggs before we move into experimental reproduction. So I don't think that animal eggs will entirely solve the issue. I mean, they are what Australian scientists now use for the most part. So there will be some forms of science and scientific research, I think, where human eggs will actually be essential. Yeah, and currently are being used, but in limited numbers.
Yeah, I think the stem cell source for gametes, both oocytes and sperm, is really well and truly underway. So I think that can also be considered, although perhaps it wouldn't be, they wouldn't be considered genuine gametes in the full developmental potential, but they may be useful as a research.
They may well be. Yeah, that's right. And I mean, the difficulty is whether they kind of confound the results, because if you get any kind of adverse effects or outcomes, for instance, you're not necessarily going to know whether it's from the experimental procedure you've just done or whether it's from the fact that they were derived from stem cells. So, they were a little bit tricky and kind of passing some of those issues. But I think, certainly in some research that might well be appropriate. Yeah.
Okay, unless anyone else wants to quickly come in, because we've got lots of questions, I'm going to go to those first. And we'll start with a nice easy one, which has proved to be the most popular. What do the panel think about retrospective removal of donor anonymity? Is it fair? So I don't know who wants to go on that one first. Perhaps we'll go to the bioethics person on the panel. We'll go to Catherine first.
Sorry, Sarah, I was distracted by looking at the Q&A.
Yeah. So what do the panel think about the retrospective removal of donor anonymity? Is it fair?
Yeah, look, it's complicated, and it has been controversial. When Victoria in particular made that decision to make the removal of anonymity retrospective, it was a controversial decision. At the same time, I think they're not making it retrospective actually adds in a kind of element of the ad hoc. So if you were born in 1998, for instance, you can find out who your parents were. But if you were born in 2000, you can find out who your parents were, but you can't if you were born in 1998. So that then becomes a little bit arbitrary when you have those kinds of markers of separating out when someone was born 10 or 15 years ago to determine whether they can find out who their their genetic parents are. So I think on the whole, I think that retrospectivity is probably a good thing. It does kind of raise questions around what people thought was going to happen when they first donated sperm, for example, which is generally what we're talking about in this question of retrospectivity at the moment.
Yeah. Stephen.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think on balance, it's the right decision to do that. and it's complex because there are donors. I've seen men who have been found out 40 years after the event that, well, someone did a ancestry.com search, and then a member of my family did it, and as a result I've been found out, and then there's sort of been fear. But research that was done in Victoria was that a good number of the sperm donors there wanted to know. They wanted to know what had happened with the children. What I think two other aspects that stand out to me. In Queensland, we are talking about having retrospective laws, and that'll mainly impact with sperm donation. So we're going back to the late 1970s and the early 1980s. So these were doctors doing on their own, didn't have any regulation. So the expectation is there will be records. There may be no records, or the records may be so scant that they're indecipherable, because doctors weren't expecting to comply with some regulatory regime. They were just doing it on their own, writing probably handwritten notes in their scribble. The other one that stands out to me is South Africa. South African donation is enormous. But a few years ago, the South African Law Reform Commission recommended that an Australian-type model of the donor-conceived person being able to find out where they came from has been recommended. And what's interesting about that is the law hasn't changed, as I understand, in South Africa, but the egg donor agencies, because there are agencies in South Africa, have changed the way that they've practiced. So they've said to the women, look, if you're going to be donating, and donation in South Africa has to be altruistic, but if you're going to be donating, you have to consent to this change that's going to happen. Sooner or later it's going to happen, so we're going to plan for it today.
Alan?
Sarah, I don't think it's a secret any longer. DNA sequencing, allows you to find out relatives relatively easy. And VARTA in Victoria been, helping people find out, who their donors are. And I think it's a good thing. And it's certainly, you can't imagine that it's going to be secret any longer with the capabilities of the DNA sequencing and the banks that are available. You can find out pretty easily, and there are people who help you do that. VARTA's one, but there are private people who help you work that out.
Nicky,
and sorry, I just wanted to jump in one other thing there, Sarah. I mentioned also before about Google reverse image searches. It's common for egg donor agencies, for example, or egg banks to say, here is a picture of your prospective donors. Why don't you pick one? Well, if you take that photo and you put it through a Google search, you may well find out who that woman is. And I can say that clients of mine have done that. I didn't ask them to do that. I feel really uncomfortable about the process of doing that because, in my view, it should be the donor-conceived person who has the autonomy to decide, do I want to know or don't I want to know? But here are the intended parents. They've just gone out and done it themselves because they know those tools are available because of their expertise in the area, and they found out. And in one case, oh yes, well, I said, this is an anonymous egg donor agreement. I certainly don't recommend that. And my client said, I already know who she is. I've done the search. I can tell you. I can say what her name is, what street she lives in. That's the nature of the world today. Anonymity is dead.
And who knows what the next technology will be that will make it even simpler. We're thinking, we talk about really cutting edge things, but these things take us by surprise every couple of years almost. Nicky, I didn't know whether you wanted to come on this one with a sort of more European perspective.
Well, just on the point of donors, as cultural and social changes take place, donors are part of that, aren't they? So I think, actually we've seen a lot of donors re-register to be identifiable in the UK, and I think that shows that, as these things change and the law changes to kind of keep up, people generally are already thinking, and there'll be some people for whom that's not the case, but people will. And I think the point about formal systems as well, rather than having people, trying to find, because it's not as easy as it might first seem to find donors, but it is certainly increasingly the case. But having those formal processes of support, one of the things we found in our second project on direct consumer genetic testing is people don't necessarily have those kind of frameworks in place when they're reaching out and making these connections. So if, you know, in a retrospective model, the formal system kind of provides some of that support if people need it. So I think that is a really positive move.
Okay, so we've got a comment and a question from Sonia Allen. So she says, may I suggest we need to consider the language we use regarding allowing patients to access information from birth and open identity, e.g. donors being confronted with open identity. My research has shown that many donors have wanted this for decades too, something which actually Stephen just alluded to. Donation was not a anonymity was not a choice for them, and many wonder about the children born. We also know that the earlier children know, the better. Recognition that donor-conceived people would want to access information is as old as the use of donors itself. It has just taken many decades to get them such access. I suggest, 1, some push for anonymity is commercially based, not interest-based. 2, we need to shift thinking, celebrate the ability to help people have families and be open about how this happens and who is involved. I'm wondering if the panel agree that working on removing stigma and secrecy is preferable. So who wants to come in on that one first? I saw lots of nods from Catherine, so we'll go to her first. I think Stephen will want to come in.
Look, I don't have much to say except to resoundingly agree with much of that comment in terms of the change of language and really the kind of virtues of clarity. I think it is really in the interest of the child that if they wish to know who their genetic parent is, then they should have access to finding that information. Not all children necessarily will want to know, but they should have access to that information if they do.
And Stephen?
I agree with Sonia. And, you know, as I said in my own case, children of same-sex couples will know that they've been conceived through some form of donation. And so those couples have to be upfront. They can't hide it like a lot of straight couples do. They just can't. They've just got to be upfront with the child. And we all know our own birthdays because, not because we've seen it on a birth certificate, but because our parents have taught us from the year dot. And this is just part of the received wisdom of who we are, that if we're open with our children, it makes certainly less of a burden for them, much easier for them to accept who they are.
Alan?
Sarah, I think the issue probably for those donors, particularly in the past, was their uncertainty about whether they might have to support those children financially. And since the laws have changed, you know, in time, their protection they've been protected from that, I think, generally speaking. So I think that's what I used to hear was the concern was that, you know, maybe there'd be a whole lot of people wanting to, that they would have to support, but I don't think that's the case any longer. It may be in some places.
That is still there, Alan. Those blokes who donated all those years ago, and they've been in contact with me and said, you know, I've been found out through, you know, some means such as Ancestry.com, one of the databases. Part of the worry that's been expressed is, will the child inherit from me? Do I have a liability for child support if the child's under 18?
I think the laws have actually covered that off, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. Yeah, they have. And of course, you know, it's very quick advice. No, you're not liable. And no, the child doesn't inherit. Obviously, if you bring the child into your life and you provide for the child in your will, that's different. But I mentioned it because the fear's still there, at least for some of those old donors.
No, I think that's right. Yeah, but it shouldn't be there. And
yeah,
you know.
Yeah, I guess the fear is there and the legal advice is quick to give, but it perhaps doesn't take away from them perhaps a little nagging thing that this is, you know, this person is genetically related to them, and perhaps they feel some moral obligation from somewhere to make some sort of provision. But obviously they're not compelled to do so. I just wanted to come in on a quick point from Jenny O'Callaghan saying, sadly, parents were told not to tell their children, this is back in the day, and it was the same in the UK, that what they were doing, and this was thought to be the right course of action. But it's surprising that no one that keeping family secrets has multiple consequences, and mostly negative. And I think that's something that I think we'll all agree on that sort of how those secrets can be problematic going forward. So the next question, the next most popular question, is one from Marilyn Crawshaw, and that's probably directed to you first, Stephen, because it's a point that you made. So she said that many people becoming parents through surrogacy don't have the choice of using known donors or a genetic surrogate. So some only give their child a partial origins story, telling them about the surrogate, but not that a donor was also used. Should we be moving towards a system that allows only genetic surrogacy or gestational surrogacy with a known donor or donors whose identity can be released at birth? What do you think about changing? I mean, surrogates itself is problematic in Australia, but let's
we don't
consider this issue.
I think the issue is, what we've seen in the last couple of years across the world, or the last 4 years, is that there's been great pressure on surrogacy destinations. For example, the United States, Canada, because of two factors. First, because of COVID, and second, because the second largest surrogacy destination, Ukraine, got invaded. And so what we've seen is a rise in what are perceived as riskier destinations, such as various Latin American countries. And the result is that when donations occur in several of those countries, they are anonymous. And I think over time that'll probably change. But I think to say that you can't do it is going to be denying people the ability to become parents. I have the conversation with clients who say, look, we can't find a surrogate here. Where do we go? And the United States is far too expensive for most. Canada, you can't match for 2 years. So they say, well, we're not going to go to Canada. Okay, we're going to go to Latin America. And then it's a case of, well, how do you minimise the risk? What I've seen with the United States, which is interesting, is that in the last few years, there has been a move away from anonymity. Anonymity was the model used in the United States. And you'd have some known donors and some open identity donors, but there's certainly been an increase in open identity donors because of the databases. There's this realisation you're not anonymous anymore. And whatever we might have today in terms of those databases, if we move, aside from any technological change, just assume we've got the same form of databases. If we move 20 years forward to when a child born today is an adult, imagine the amount of data that's there then.
Yeah, Alan.
It seems unreasonable to me in Australia that, patients have to go to South Africa, in large numbers because they can get eggs and surrogacy there in South Africa much more easily, and egg donation is much more available there. And why don't we do something about what happens in Australia, which is necessary to compensate the donors for donating in a reasonable way? And I think this is what Catherine and others think about and talk about. It really needs to happen because it's sort of crazy, driving on patients into other places and utilising systems that are probably not really ideal, I think. That's the wrong thing, I think, and we ought to mature. We're in a mature society. We should take on what the issues are here and deal with them properly, is my view.
No argument from me, Alan. I'll just say South Africa, foreigners can't access surrogacy there because they've got to be domiciled in South Africa. It's just a technical point. But you look at a country like Spain. Spain does so much donation, but the doctors there are absolutely rigid. It must be anonymous. They think there's some benefit in it being anonymous.
Catherine.
If I can just say something, yeah, I think it's really interesting in Australia that on the one hand, we've been really technologically at the forefront in many ways in assisted reproduction, but we've also been quite cautious and potentially even conservative in terms of the ethics and regulation of that reproductive technology. So as part of that, we've kind of cleaved to this distinction between an altruistic system and commercialization. You know, that's the only way we've kind of seen this, and commercialization is inherently bad, and altruism is you know, what we've had to kind of cleave to and stick with. But I think we're at a stage now where we can think a bit more creatively about the kind of space between those things. It's not actually, that's not the distinction we have to work with. It's a false dichotomy to think about that, and actually think more carefully about what's really involved in donation and what's actually a fair compensation for donors that's still maintaining the value of altruism, the kind of ethical value of altruism, but actually also being a bit fairer and more just. So I think that's where we're at now.
I'm going to move on to a sort of related question for the way the conversation's been going. I mean, why do the panel think there is a shortage of donors in countries like Australia and the UK when, you know, countries like Spain, you know, it's almost the go-to place? I don't know whether Nicky, you wanted to come into that first from your research.
Sure. Yeah, it's I think a big part of the answer to this question is about clinics' behaviours, not donors' behaviours. And certainly in the UK, I think what we saw when the last increase in compensation was introduced back in 2011 was a change in clinics' behaviours. And somebody in the panel, I think it was Catherine, mentioned the decrease in egg sharing in the UK. And I think clinics saw the increase in compensation as a way in which they might be able to, it made it more straightforward for them to be able to compensate donors. And they saw it as a way to be able to recruit donors, essentially. And I think that changed their behaviour, and it'll be interesting to see if that has any impact on the more recent raises in compensation, have any further kinds of impact. But I think it's about what we see in the Spanish context is, you said, you know, that Spanish clinics are very well geared. Most of the egg donation in Spain takes place in the private sector. Clinics have very well-oiled marketing machinery around them. We see that in some of the more commercial clinics in the UK as well, where they have PR departments dedicated to developing advertising. A few months ago in the UK, there was a bit of a debate emerged around the use of social media for advertising for egg donors, and there were a few things written in the press, and there was a bit of a flurry of interest about, should we be having targeted social media posts for women in the age category that they would be eligible for donation, should that happen? Because there were a few journalists that had these targeted social media posts, and that comes from this kind of very clear model of recruitment that some of these clinics can achieve. So I think a big part of it is about what clinics do, and when there's a well set up kind of framework and market around egg donation, clinics are, I would say, more kind of full on in terms of their market, you know, their marketing and recruitment. I think, you know, egg donation remains a very difficult thing for people to go through, and so that, you know, we do have fewer numbers. But in the UK, what we've seen in recent years is egg donation become concentrated in a small number of clinics. We don't have very much NHS egg donation, and we talked to clinics in the NHS who told us they don't have the resources to go out and recruit egg donors. So I think a big part of the answer to that question is about actually what clinics do, and not necessarily so much about individuals wanting to donate. I think just to add to that, some of the donors that we spoke to had the kind of impression that they had donated to the NHS when in fact they donated in their local private clinic, but they hadn't sort of made that distinction. But there was this sense that they were donating into the kind of NHS system, because people assume that infertility treatment takes place in the NHS in the UK, and it often doesn't. So yeah, I think we should be asking more the question about what clinics are doing.
Do you think that's a similar situation in Australia? I don't know who wants to come in on that, Catherine or Stephen?
Yeah, look, I'm happy to say a couple of things. I think there's a number of factors that play into the situation in Australia. I mean, one of the really key factors, which is also related to the questions of what clinics do, is that many people in Australia simply don't know about egg donation. So I would say that most women in Australia would not know that it's a possibility, because we don't have public conversations about egg donation. The clinics themselves have not been especially proactive in terms of recruiting egg donors. We just do not have a culture whereby people go to clinics to donate eggs. The eggs that clinics do have are typically eggs that are left over from someone else's. So a person will go to a clinic to go through fertility treatment, and she will have her eggs collected, and sometimes she will have a surplus of those eggs. So then she may donate to another couple. So that's really where the clinic recruited donors are coming from. Clinics themselves are not proactive in terms of actually having campaigns to recruit egg donors. So there's a lack of cultural understanding that this is an option. There's a lack of proactivity on the parts of the clinics to some extent. And I think there's also a regulatory framework that is complex. I mean, as Stephen kind of indicated, it varies by states. So, we're not working with kind of consistent frameworks across different states. But the guidelines and legislation we have also puts different age limits on, and quite strict age limits on who can donate for different things, having to have completed your family. So there's this idea that egg donation has negative implications for future fertility, which is very firmly embedded and is required to be part of the consent processes, despite the fact that there's not a lot of evidence for that. But our guidelines are kind of conservative around this. And I think, frankly, they need to be updated, and so we can move ahead.
And we've had
I agree with all that, and I just add, and we don't pay. We know that women who are donors have a risk of death, just like surrogates have a risk of death. Now, it might be small, but being an egg donor isn't a pleasant experience. In 2011, the ASRM estimated that the commitment of an egg donor was 50 plus hours, for a sperm donor, including counselling, an hour. And then a few years later, they walked back those numbers, but that's probably a fair guide. It's a significant psychological commitment where you're putting a needle into your stomach for a fortnight every day. That's pretty awful. And when you might end up with an adverse outcome, who would want to do it if they're not being compensated for it?
Alan.
There are the marketing for egg freezing for reproductive insurance is pretty aggressive, and a lot of young women are doing that, and they're not using their eggs, as Catherine has shown in that data. So this is where you should go for that source, because if they're not being used, it's crazy to be thrown out. And so the aggressiveness of the clinics, or some clinics, I should say, some clinics in marketing egg freezing, as an insurance of fertility, is really out of this world, and it's just can't believe it myself. But there's a source of eggs there that are probably not going to be used, or very few of them are going to be used.
I can imagine a similar thing will happen in the UK, because again, the aggressive marketing. A comment from Melissa Seedy, who says that regarding the public egg bank in Victoria, Australia, I'm involved as a fertility counsellor. Anecdotally and very interestingly, there are so many, very many more egg donors coming forward to donate than I ever experienced in the private sector. So make that what you will. So we shall go now to the next question, which is from Lucia or Lucia. She said, my donor-conceived teenagers find the transactional element of paying for eggs highly offensive. So think about the fact that donor-conceived babies grow up into thinking young people and adults. Okay, not saying you shouldn't pay donors, but instead better have focus on recruitment, including known donors. It's very complex, I acknowledge, and more effort is needed. But I thought, known donors don't come without ethical issues, because there could, and I wondered if Catherine, you wanted to talk about that, or the other panelists, because they're a sort of small financial inducement, like having your reasonable expenses paid and, a small amount on top of that, not enough to sort of act as a particular inducement, compared with sort of social or familial pressure to help somebody, is another thing in and of itself, isn't it? So Catherine, and then perhaps Nicky.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting comment, and I think, that kind of that worry about the transactional nature of payment really kind of underlies the distaste that a lot of people have for moving to a full market-based system. I think, though, that and I really appreciate that. I don't think we ought to move to a market-based system at all in Australia, but I do think we can think more about systems of compensation that fully recognise the kinds of burdens that egg donation may entail, that are just a little bit more than, kind of just saying, well, you've done a great thing in kind of donating altruistically, and, thanks a lot for that. So it's really just being able to kind of recognise the risk and the commitment that women are going and taking on when they do egg donation, and how we can think differently around that. So it's not market-based, it's not transactional, and in the way that the comment is expressing discomfort with, and I endorse that discomfort, but also has a kind of, is a bit fairer to donors themselves, I suppose.
Nicky.
Yeah, I've been looking back actually this week at our interviews and the data on compensation in light of the changes in the HFEA's rules around compensation. Our donors, and I speak for the UK here, the compensation wasn't, and obviously, we have a self-selecting sample across the study, so it could be that for other donors this is true, but across the 3 countries, the interviews that we did, compensation, the financial compensation, often wasn't the only reason. So people have really complex reasons for doing anything, we know that. And sometimes what was interesting is the reasons people donated changed between cycles. So sometimes people did 1 or 2 or sometimes 3 cycles of donation. Sometimes the initial cycle they were interested in the compensation, but then learned more about the process coming through the clinic, and then went back, and the second time wanted to, maybe because the family wanted to have a second child, and so their motivation for donating was different. Most of the women in the UK, the money wasn't really a factor, but the money did enable them, and most of them donated under the £750 rule, enable them to do it. So they did have quite considerable expenses, especially if they were donating in a city where they didn't live. So, actually what they ended up with was a small amount of money that was left over when they'd taken into account the train fares and the hotels and so on that they needed. So it wasn't that important to them. And then the other thing in relationship to the kind of question of known donation, should we be encouraging known donation instead of a system of compensation? I don't think you can equate the two things. I think they are entirely different, from the reasons that Sarah alluded to, is that an intra-family donation is very different from a donation in the current system in the UK, at least, where you have ID release donation where the reasons the person donated, the relationships within the family are completely different. So I think I would say known donor, we have to think of them as two different forms of donation, and one doesn't really replace the other. You might want to have both systems, but I think they're not equivalent for all sorts of reasons.
Okay. Oh, go on, Stephen.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in there because known donors, well, you know, I'm parent of a child through a known donation, and it's been marvellous. But there's risks, and one of the risks, aside from that have been identified about potential coercion, is the donor a parent or a donor? And that was a very issue that my client and her ex argued about all the way through court, and has seen a series of other cases, primarily with men as the gamete providers. Is the person a donor or a parent? And if they're a donor, at least under Australian law, if they would be typically seen by the court as being someone concerned with the care, welfare, and development of the child, being the genetic parent. And if that's the case, then they've got a right to litigate concerning that child. And what relationship should the child have with that person? So it's really important to get that stuff right at the beginning, but prior to the birth of the child. And it's often not done. What we are seeing in Australia, particularly with sperm donors, unfortunately, is a lot of private donations, which are extremely worrying, unregulated, and no caps, anything like that. Egg donation, because it's happening through clinics, is much more regulated.
Yes. Yeah, you can't do an informal egg donation agreement in the same way. Perhaps, thank goodness. There's a comment, well, and a question from Julie Potts. Well, it's why are donor registers still referred to as donor rather than genetic history registers when an egg provider in a lesbian couple is clearly not a donor? Is this another area where we need to think about the language here and start calling them something else? I don't know who wants to comment on that one first. Perhaps we'll go to Nicky.
Yeah, we had some cases in our research in the UK actually of same-sex couples who had used kind of the shared motherhood model and had been dissatisfied with the way that had been handled by the clinic. And in most cases, I think clinics, you know, in terms of practice, handle that quite well. But in the UK, the HFEA paperwork that's required for people to complete is based on the kind of donation model, and so people were left feeling very alienated by those clinical processes. And I think there's a lot of variability in practice around that. So I think, you know, there are lots of ways in which that can be a problem, because we haven't quite got to grips, I think, with and this is another good case of how practice and policy doesn't always keep up with what people are actually doing and how people are creating families. So I think we do need to do some work around some of these questions for sure.
Does anybody else want to come in on this one?
I'll just jump in and say it's the call of Parliament, what they call it. But have a discussion about language. I think it's fair. I think it's a fair comment. We've got these names. You know, we've seen the same with surrogacy. We had intended parents called commissioning parents, which sounds like they're buying a fridge, which was just awful. And then we've changed and arranged parents and substitute parents, just awful phrases, and now gone to intended parents. Having a discussion about language, I think, is good.
Yes. And there's also, and I think it's also come up in one of the questions, I think, about that, the importance of language here and who we're referring to as parents and whether a donor is a parent. And, you know, in some situation that, as Stephen has already said, you know, that boundary can be more blurred than in other situations where. So, okay. So there's a question about Ukraine. This is an anonymous attendee. I wonder if you know more about egg donors from Ukraine. Who are they? How are they recruited? What's their financial, social situation? Knowing that donor conceived people seek information, are we thinking about the implications of importing gametes from these locations. So does anyone know of any details on what's happening in regard to donation from Ukraine? Has it restarted?
Others will probably comment, but certainly donation within Ukraine is enormous. But what we've certainly seen in Australia has been the import of eggs from Ukraine, and that has been at least the stated purpose must be to comply with Australian requirements, namely that open identity over time, plus not be plus Australian counselling, plus not be commercial. But one has to wonder how that actually comes together. So it'll just be interesting to see how that comes together. And I should say Victoria has banned, I should say VADA has banned the import of eggs from Ukraine. And they raised the legitimate concerns. Well, is the child actually going to find out who the woman is if she dies or disappears as a result of the war?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question now. This one is from Miana Lots. Thanks for the presentations. I'd be very interested to hear the panel's views about matching. Ethnic, cultural, religious background and appearance all figure among the match preference options for potential egg recipients here in Australia. This is not without ethical problems, in my opinion. Your thoughts on this would be super interesting to hear. So, Catherine, have you thought much about the issue of matching?
I haven't, no. And I think actually I was hoping that Nicky might respond to this question, because I think she may have some research data on how people and why people want donor matching. I think, in some ways it can be a little bit ethically problematic. In other ways, I can understand people's desire. But I think I'd be really interested to see or to hear from Nicky, actually.
Nicky?
Yeah, sure. I hope you can still hear me because my headphones have given up the ghost. Yes, we've done research in the past, actually, which has looked at this in a little bit more detail. And matching is interesting, and it comes from a context of anonymity, of course, where patients, recipients were encouraged not to tell children about the nature of their conception. So matching for kind of phenotypical characteristics became really important, so that the child conceived would fit in. I think there is still a desire for a level of matching between donors and recipient families, not necessarily because they're not going to tell children, but because it removes the need to constantly have it as a point of discussion, having questions about resemblance and so on. Matching came up in research that we did on fertility travel, where people had travelled abroad and had donors and then were quite surprised by the appearance of their children, and it had been a point of discussion, even if their children knew it was. So I think matching is complicated in the sense that it's important for different reasons in different families and so on. But I think going back to the point I raised in the slides about how matching is used to sell donation has become interesting, I think, and particularly with some of the new technologies that have emerged. I think it demonstrates that in part, there is still a desire, and some of those, the kind of combinations of those techniques that I mentioned in terms of AI with forms of expanded carrier screening and so on have become quite prolific in the Spanish context, where donors are still anonymous. So if people are traveling there for anonymous donors, that might be important to them, that whether the child, can look as close to the resemblance of the parents as possible, is being marketed. I think it is shifting the nature of matching, but I think, we're seeing it in certain contexts being used as a way to sell donation as a perfect match. I think there is actually even a package called the perfect match, and obviously charging lots of money for that. So I think those anxieties are being exploited, where people are worried about this constant need for talk within the family or outside of the family about the resemblance of children, partly because of the question of the point that an audience member made earlier about the stigma. You know, there is still stigma for some people in using donor gamete. So I think it directly taps into those anxieties for some people.
Okay,
I was
Alan.
going to say, look out.
Oh, sorry.
If you've got intended parents in China, for example, and they're going to the United States for egg donation, they don't want a Caucasian egg donor. They don't want a Latin or a black egg donor. They want an Asian egg donor, one that looks like them. They want to make sure that their child, when born, actually looks like them. And that's true, I think, for many of the clients that I've seen where they have an egg donor. They want that. But I've had clients who say, well, you know, actually, I'm Caucasian, but I'm going to have a Latin egg donor. It doesn't matter. They don't care. Having mixed races, they see it as being a plus. But for many people, particularly heterosexual couples or those from less diverse societies, and by that I mean less racially diverse societies, such as, for example, China, they'll be wanting a child who looks like them, and therefore want an egg donor who looks like them.
Okay, I'm going to move on and take one last question. And Alan, this is for you. Cast your mind back. What were the team's hopes and fears for egg donation 40 years ago? And did any of those hopes and fears come true?
No, I think at the time that we were working in some sort of vacuum about, you know, what people would think about it. But you know, at that time there was a very sort of big push from the patient saying, this is something, you know, you've done IVF, you know, please help us because, you know, we want to have a child as well. And so the only way for them was to have it by egg donation. And essentially we felt that, you know, that we were really trying to help those particular patients that were there asking us to help them. I mean, I just remember the sense of being able to design something that would actually work was really very interesting as a scientist. But the overall feeling was that, you know, here's a solution for something that hasn't been solved in the past, and so isn't that terrific? I mean, we didn't really think forward to what might happen in all these applications, but we did know that we were going to have a bit of an argument with government and some people about doing donation. It wasn't always approved by everybody, clearly, what we were doing in those days. So we knew we were up for the argument, but we felt that this was really something that the patients needed and they deserved. So we were prepared to do it within that context. And we were kind of surprised in a way that the government responded in saying, you know, you're going too fast with these things, and then sort of slow it all down and then be extremely slow in actually allowing it to happen. So a degree of frustration once we'd got it started, and the people that we're trying to help but couldn't be helped here, and we had that go somewhere else or wait. And that was frustrating. But, you know, as scientists who are sort of breaking the frontiers, you do get frustrated because in these areas, there's not everybody's going to agree with you. And particularly in conservative politics, it can be a very difficult place to actually make these things happen.